My name is Jim Morgan, and I'm also known as the blind clockmaker. But I haven't always been blind. In the winter of 2014, March the 8th, I was riding my bicycle with my wife and 3 friends back from the beach at Fort Myers where they had the shrimp festival. While I was going through a crosswalk, I got hit by a car going about 40 miles an hour. As a direct result of the accident, I became totally blind, and it has changed my life forever. I don't ever turn these lights on, but unless someone's following me in the shop. To start the process, I have to select a dial. This dial came from a company called Clockit in Wisconsin, where I get all my clock movements and hands and dials. So to start the process, because this is a dimension that I must use, I start with the dial and build the clock around it. So this is the dial for the clock that I'm making. Use a set of dividers to find the center. So it's one of my layout tools I never used to use, and I have to use all the time now. Before my accident, I was a contractor. I built custom homes for years. I also did a lot of woodworking, building cabinets professionally, and teaching woodworking. So I had a lot of experience with my hands in the shop with the power tools in woodworking. Now that I'm blind, I had to come up with another way of doing what I used to do. I wasn't going to just give up. I wanted to keep creating. You might ask yourself, how does a blind person build clocks? Use power tools, do power woodworking? Well, it's different and it's challenging, but I'm not one to say that it can't be done. I just look for a way to do it. For instance, I use a talking tape measure, which tells me measurements to 1/16 of an inch so that I can size my material the way I like it, the dimension that I want. And I have made for myself 4 wooden blocks, the smallest being 3/8 by 3/4 by 1.5, going up to 3/4 by 1.5 inches by 3 inches. So each measurement is doubled, the thickness, the width, and to the length, And I use those blocks for setting a lot more precise measurements on my table saw, my miter saw, and other processes such as drilling holes. And so those blocks is just a method that I came up with on my own to be accurate in what I'm doing. This will make the two longer sides of the dial frame. This will make two parts that are going to be at the top of the clock, and they will be just enough wood for that. Shutting off the time. To make another pass. The way I go about building a clock is it first has to start as an image in my mind. The intellectual part hasn't changed from before I was blind till now. I still have to have an idea about what I want to build, what I want it to look like, and so forth. So that image then, I create methods, sizes, shapes in my mind, and then I have to make those appear in the shop with my hands. My next process for the frame is to cut a rabbet on the inside of this for the plywood and the dial to fit into, and I do that on the table saw with the guard removed. The only way you can do it. I'm not cutting all the way through the wood, so I have to lower my splitter down so that it clears. Then I take the plywood, use it to gauge my height of the blade and the rip fence. Some things I used to do by sight are actually done closer by feel anyway. So if I start with a piece of exotic wood, very expensive, and I only have so much of it to work with, I have to conjure a way that I can cut the pieces out of that piece of wood without wasting any, and that is the challenge. So I begin by rough cutting the larger pieces in my mind to size first, working my way down to the smaller ones before I take the next step of actually sizing them to the exact sizes that I want. The only hardship is that all of those measurements, sizes, shapes, and everything has to be in my mind. I can't refer to a sketch or a drawing or a dimension on a piece of paper. I have to visualize everything and then build it from just what I am seeing in my imagination. I always try to cut it about a 1/16 big, and then I can work it down. So now it's a matter of drilling some holes and put some screws here to hold the frame together. Here's my screws. 1 5/8 is right over here. About a 32nd each way. So that's the dial frame. I only need to put a little glue in, screw it back together, sand it, and then I'm going to do a little routing on the inside here and then sand it, and it is ready for the clock to go around it. This dimension right here is a very critical dimension, and I'm going to use the actual object itself to set that dimension on my miter saw so that the boards that go across the clock here and here are exactly that dimension. These are two boards that go across the top of the clock that I'm going to cut curves on with my bandsaw. And to do that, I made myself a circle jig that fits on the bandsaw so I can cut arches, because I cannot follow a line, obviously. It'll cut a regular curve by having a pivot point, which you will see when I start cutting here. So I'll take my 1/4 inch bit that I drilled the hole with, and I'll use it for the pivot point. And I think I've got this first hole, okay, it goes like this. I think around 11 inch maybe radius. It's just a feel thing. Feels right to me, so that's what it is. So that's going to go on there like that, and you can see how that's going to pivot into the blade. Now the real tricky part is, how do you fasten that to the end of the board right here? And I use a woodworker's trick, two-sided carpet tape. I'm going to press it in to that carpet tape, and it doesn't seem like tape would hold that, but believe me, it does. Because I took the time to make sure that the pivot point itself from the edge is identical to the distance to the front of the teeth, they should be exactly the same here and here. And I think I've got that set about 3 inches, which will be the side of the clock. And we can tell here, there's my 3-inch block, and it is just almost exactly 3 inches there and there. So a lot of my friends always ask me, how can that be safe, working out in the shop with power table saw, miter saw, and so forth, when you can't see? Well, I do it all by feel, and it's machines that I have used before. And to be honest with you, I am a lot more careful than I used to be. I think probably the chances of me having an accident now are less than it used to be. I always contemplate and figure where my hands are in relation to every cut I'm making, so that there is no danger of getting a finger or a thumb in the blade instead of a piece of wood. Before, when I was doing woodworking, the bigger the shop, the better. Bigger tools, more room for cutting plywood and everything. That turns out to not be such a good idea for a blind woodworker. As long as my projects are fairly small in size, the size of the shop is not a problem. So I'm often asked the question, how much of this work are you actually just doing on your own, or are you getting help with it? Well, I'm getting very little help, and the help that I get is in identifying the lumber sometimes, and also looking at the grain of the wood so that I might have the best looking piece, desirable piece on the side or on the outside of the clock. So occasionally I will take a part into my wife for her to look at to tell me which side looks better. I have her stick a piece of Scotch tape on that side. When I go back to the shop, as I work with that piece, I can keep feeling the Scotch tape and knowing which side goes out or which side goes up. And then in the finishing process, I use a tung oil product, which is basically put on by hand with a rag in several coats. And I can do that myself, but I can't examine it very well. So Kathy helps me in determining if I have missed a spot or I need more finish in one particular place. But other than that, when I start the building of a clock, I am on my own pretty much until that clock is finished. In most cases, the clock that I'm working on has a special purpose for a special person, either as a gift for a graduation, a wedding, or just as a friendship gift. But sometimes I just go out and build a clock, and then it becomes clear to me at the end where that clock is going to go, who's going to receive it and for what reason. Okay, now I have laminated a board with the wenge and the maple in stripes. And this is a part that goes on the bottom of the clock between the two sides, and my label will go right in here. So what I want to do is I want to bevel one edge of it that matches the bevel on the two sides. So I'm going to set the joiner at that bevel. I'm going to run that bevel, and the reason that I allow these to stick out further is because I can tell where the edge of the bevel comes to by feel, because I can't see the color difference. Since I have always been an active person, I had to find an avenue that would keep me active, keep me involved, keep my mind working, and do something that I feel is good for somebody else. And that's my motivation in building the clocks. I always have a goal, and I always hope that whoever receives it gets as much pleasure from receiving it as I do in building it and giving it to them. So if you are one of those people who receive a clock from me, I will make two guarantees. First of all, it'll be one of a kind because I am not good at copying. And secondly, the person that built that clock will never ever see it. advice to anyone who goes through a traumatic experience like I did and becomes unsighted or crippled in some other way is do not sell yourself short. You can do much more than you think you can, and you can definitely do much more than others think you can. So apply yourself and figure out a way of being useful the way you were before the accident in a different way.